What if everything you thought you knew about negotiation was backwards? There's a framework that's been used to close deals worth millions, deals where both parties walked away satisfied. This session on how to negotiate mutually beneficial deals reveals strategies that work whether you're in a boardroom or a research lab. The principles are simple, but the results can be transformative. It's time to discover what's possible.
So today, what we're going to talk about is why negotiate a deal. What are the drivers that we have to negotiate a deal? We might have a piece of research that we're interested in. What is it that we want to do with that research? How do we engage with industry? And what are the motivators for industry to actually engage with us and get a deal done? I'll talk a little bit about what kind of deals there are. Very high level. I think there's other talks in the campus register of talks about specifics in licensing. But we'll talk about high-level type of deals that are out there, and just to familiarize with the language of some of the types of deals that we're talking about in licensing. We'll also talk about deal considerations. What is it that we should be thinking about as part of the deal? Perhaps sometimes thinking about not just from our perspective, but from the licensee perspective as well. So we're trying to figure out what it is that their motivators are from that perspective. Key thing in embarking in the negotiations and deals is really understanding very carefully who you are negotiating with. So often we go into negotiations or into discussions with the industry without actually considering what are the motivators that they're driving and really are they the right fit. So before we actually start the whole process of negotiating a deal, it's important to actually understand what the mutual synergies are and what it is that you are bringing to the table for the industry partner. So, very careful diligence on understanding the different partners, selecting the partner of choice is really key to actually success of the deal in the end. We'll talk a little bit about the due diligence process. Again, the due diligence process is typically the process that the industry partner will go through to try and assess whether there's a fit, the strength of your technology, the strength of your IP, familiarization about exactly what it is, the content of what they may be looking for. Is important to really understand from an early stage of the deal what it is they may want to see, the data pack in terms of due diligence. And also maybe we'll talk a little bit about how best to share that information so that it makes it easy for the industry partner who you're doing the deal with. And I'm using the word industry because that's often the case with the deals I've done, that how they want to see, what they want to see in the format they want to see. And then we'll also at the very end of the talk about beyond the deal. So often we focus on the negotiation of the deal, but we actually lack focus on actually what happens beyond that deal. So signing the contract and signing an agreement is really only half the actual approach. It's actually very important in the alliance management side of things. So very quickly, a little bit about my background. So I come from a research background. I've been a postdoc at Baylor College of Medicine, background in genetics. And then I went into industry probably in the mid-90s in the UK in a British biotech company. I shifted from research group leader to business development probably about 25 years ago. It was a natural switch for me because there was a technology that I was the inventor on. It was natural for me to be the person that went out to industry, to engage with industry and sell that technology. That got me into the deal-making aspect. We do deals with GSK, Medarex, and a bunch of other companies. And then I came out to Australia to run a CSIRO spin-out called Evogenics. That company went very well. We took it onto the public markets. It became Arana. And then we sold Arana Therapeutics back in 2010. And since then, I've also started a couple of other companies. I've been a CEO of ASX-listed Prescient Therapeutics, a managing director, also CEO of Q Oncology, which is a brand and capital venture-backed company, and also now run a consulting company called Concept Clinic. I've also worked very closely with the federal government, Department of Industry, in a couple of its programs on the entrepreneurs program. So going out there, talking to entrepreneurs and funding the startup companies. So I have a lot of deal making experience in my background. So let's talk about what is negotiation. What do we mean by negotiation? And I think, we see here a definition of back and forth communication designed to reach an agreement when you and the other side has some shared interests. They're shared and others that are opposed. So the idea of negotiation is you come into the table not always with thinking there's going to be an overlap in terms of what you want. So there's going to be shared common goals, but there are going to be areas where You want to retain certain things and they don't want to give up on other things. So there's going to be always a negotiation that most people are not natural born negotiators. We do, I guess, start off as kids negotiating with our parents, but to actually get to being a good negotiator, it requires education, preparation, and practice. It's something that can be learned, something that there's courses out there, there's books on it. There's definitely ways that you can upskill yourself in the negotiation skills. It's not something that comes naturally to everybody, but it's certainly something that's worth, if you're interested in this area, it's definitely worth doing that research and actually figuring out in terms of what it is that you want to try and get out of it. Motivation to reach an agreement, but to maintain one's position. So there's a bit of a dichotomy to that. That means you want to try and but you also don't want to give up everything. So there's this aspect of trying to get to this win-win situation in a deal. And that's what all negotiations all about. Deal making requires give and take. It's critical to articulate your thoughts. And very importantly, and you're going to hear me say this several times through this talk, but it's really important to listen to the other party rather than going into a deal making scenario and starting to get into the nitty gritty of doing a deal. Often you come in there with these preconceived ideas about exactly what the other party is wanting out of it. It's really important not to do that, but actually to take a step back before you go in there. Don't go into the negotiating room with preconceived ideas, but actually actively listen to what it is that the other party is wanting out of it. So what's the task of the negotiator? Well, a good negotiator shapes and structures the proceedings. So there is a real structure to what we want to try and do. And I'll talk about the structure. I'll talk about some of the tips and tricks of negotiating, but it's definitely a structured process. As I say, important to listen. That a good negotiator persuades. So the idea is that you go into negotiation with the ability to pivot, but persuade. So persuasion is a really key aspect of a good negotiator. Also, thinking on your feet, it's important that problems will arise. You'll get to a point where in certain negotiations, it's difficult to get through certain areas. It requires flexibility. Relationships as well, building relationships is absolutely key through the process. So, the best deals that I've done in my career in terms of business development is the ones where I've actually really started out with a good, strong relationship with the company. That relationship then becomes almost like a friendship through the process. And it becomes easier to go back to companies, big pharma companies in particular. Once you've built up that relationship with the company, it's easier to do the second deal with the company than it is to do the first. So the relationships are really important. And, that comes about from trust, from openness, and I guess that openness in the dialogue through the negotiation and also beyond once you've done that deal. So it's key that you build that relationship up. It takes time to build a relationship. It doesn't take very long to actually lose that relationship. So that trust and integrity is a key bit about it. Preserving relationships through the process, that's really key. It's not only through the actual deal-making process, but actually beyond the deal. So when I talk about alliance management, it's all about transparency and openness and communication and ensuring that relationship continues beyond that deal. So alliance management is absolutely key. So really the ultimate goal is to convince someone that, your proposed solution would be more beneficial than their option. So, that's the art in negotiation is when you go into a deal, is that you're actually able to persuade and to convince ultimately through a period of time. Of course, it doesn't automatically happen overnight, but it is about trying to get to a point where some of the things that you want to bring to the table, you actually get across, and that then becomes the proposed solution is the ultimate part of the ultimate deal that gets done. So responsibility of the negotiator, as I say, setting the agenda for the negotiation from the outset. So it's really key that the boundaries are set at the beginning of the negotiation. I guess that becomes part of what I see as a deal team. So everybody knows exactly who's on the other side of the table, who's on your side of the table, and the boundaries are set at the very early stages of that negotiation. And so the other responsibility of the negotiator is framing the negotiation. So what do I mean by framing is really using argument and persuasion to define the problem to be solved. So often, again, we go in with these preconceived ideas. A customer goes into an electric store and wants to buy an expensive television. The key focus there is in the consumer focus, in the mind there is the focus on the cost. So the focus is on that cost. The salesman actually points out that appliance will actually save energy and money, and it's better therefore for the environment. It's a better long-term solution. Ultimately, you'll save money. Yes, you may pay more money right now, but in the long run, you'll save money. So that framing, that reframing of the negotiation of aspect is moving the consumer from the cost of the TV to the longer term ethics of the purchase. So that's what we mean by framing in the negotiation sense. The other responsibility of the negotiator is managing the negotiation process. So, it's very true that whoever controls the process of the negotiation can ultimately powerfully influence the substance and ultimately the results of the negotiations. So whenever I go into a negotiation, I will always be the one that will actually draft term sheets. So I'll be the person that will be actually putting in the framework of what I want to see as being the ultimate goal. Now, the framework, and we'll talk about term sheets as being a framework for the negotiation process. But, often companies will say, we'll draft the term sheet. But if you take control of actually negotiations from the outset, it's actually ultimately going to be a better process. It'll be a better outcome because you'll likely get more of what it is you want out of the deal than you would if you left it in the hands of the other party. The responsibility of the negotiator, absolutely about building coalitions for success. It's all about identifying who the key individuals on your team and the key individuals that you need to get onto your team to receive the support, to receive the commitment to the deal-making process. So you're putting together the people. It could be the tech transfer, your business development people. It could be legal. It could be intellectual property people, as well as you as being the researcher, as being the key champion of the technology. It's about building that coalition for success. It's also about identifying on the other side of the party who are the key individuals also or who are holding the cards. So it's identifying who the deal champion is, not only in your team, but also the deal champion on the other side of the table negotiations. Identifying who that deal champion is not always simple, but actually often we go in with the conceived idea that the deal champion is the business development person on the other side. Often, and I've found this in my experiences, that when you're working with big pharma companies, it's often best to start with the actual technology and the research talk. So often it's the researchers that I would bring along in my team, talking to the researchers on the other type team, and it's building it up from that technology base and shared technology focus, rather than starting with numbers and royalty rates and the business development commercialization focus. So identifying who that deal champion is on the other party is absolutely key. So why negotiate the deal? What is it that that you want? What is it that the industry maybe wants? So actually, really, this is the motivators. Why negotiate a deal? What is it you think that they want? So from an industry perspective, more often than not, it's actually about filling gaps in what they've got in terms of their technology or product pipelines. They're out there looking for solutions and looking smart technology. Often, one of the things that I do is I look at the companies that would be interested in potentially using my technology or my product to actually fill some of the gaps in the problems that they've got. So if it's a pipeline, it's very easy. You look at the pipelines of products, you look at the types of technologies and products that the company is interested in, and then you actually go, okay, this is maybe where my technology or my product can actually solve the problem that they have. Industry also looks definitely for access to talent and expertise. It looks to universities as being the talent of the future. It looks to universities as places where they can access smart researchers, more or less to do virtual research, but also to access talent potentially to actually bring these researchers, embed them into industry through PhD industry programs, to actually bring them into the industry, to actually be a part of the workforce for them in the future. Opportunities to be first to market with new solutions. We're definitely seeing industry and looking to universities, to institutes for new technology platforms. So the right thing right now in medtech are things like the RNA platform, CRISPR technologies in cell and gene therapy. These are all areas that industry is really looking at, focusing. They've got problems still that universities and university researchers can solve. So really the industry is looking to solutions to some of the problems they've got. Industry often goes, right, we maybe in the future want to go in a particular direction. So licensing intellectual property at an early stage is a way that they can then future-proof some of the technology that they might develop in the future. So often it's preemptive. And the defensive position, it doesn't happen very often, but I've taken this approach in some of the deals that I've done, is actually licensing technology in from universities to block others from gaining access to that technology. The technology becomes a way of ring fencing a particular platform. So that gives you a competitive advantage. It gives you an intellectual property advantage. It gives you a freedom to operate advantage, which is what we'll talk about. And we'll talk a bit about freedom to operate down the line. From your perspective, so it's a recognition that you alone can't take that stuff to market, but linking into industry, licensing to industry, to deal with industry, that can get your technology right out into the marketplace. Again, commercializing research for public good, there's no doubt there's a driver for that. I focus most of my life in terms of oncology because I wanted to see things getting into the oncology sector, things going into patients that can make a difference. So commercializing stuff for public good is definitely a driver. Promoting economic growth, close ties with industry. There's definitely a focus now in terms of universities being, I guess, pushed in that direction by the amount of grants that are now focused on translational research. So research that is actually engaging with industry. Grant programs like the Australian Economic Accelerator Program, these are all programs which are being driven to closer ties with industry, closer engagement with the commercialization outcomes. So generating income for your university, without a doubt, that's an important factor as well, of course. So actually getting a spin-out or a piece of licensed technology that brings money into the university, absolutely key. And again, providing exposure to learnings from different skill sets. So there's no doubt that the way the industry thinks is different from the way that academics think. There's no problems with differences, but it's really actually understanding that there's synergy in terms of the skill sets. Researchers have skill sets that industry doesn't have. Industry is looking for those skill sets, and vice versa. Industry brings things like regulatory experience, reimbursement experience, marketing, the ability to take a technology or product all the way through to market. Those are all things that industry has, and those are skill sets that, as a researcher, you can benefit from by closely tying up with industry. So types of deals. So as a researcher in a university or an institute, typically you'll get exposed mostly to the licensing type of thing. So, we'll talk about licensing really in a second slide, but licensing really is for a single or a limited package of intellectual property. It typically is around a piece of intellectual property. So IP, typically a patent. The licensor, that's the university that's out licensing that technology to the company, and the company is the licensee. So those are kind of the terminology that we use. Joint venture, right? Well, so joint ventures really is where both parties contribute money into a joint venture for the development of the IP. It could be a piece of research, it could be research around a piece of intellectual property, and both parties are contributing money into that to create a joint venture. Research only, typically research only is a type of deal where it's focused on early stage to get something to a proof of concept. So it could be something where there's a defined milestone. It can be a TRL, moving it from a TRL 4, 5, 6. It can be something where there's a milestone there, but typically a research only deal is something that's focused on getting that proof of concept. Unless you've got a spin-out company that comes out from your university, but that's where the industry partner will come along, buy the whole company, not just intellectual property, but buying the company's staff, the company's organizational structures. The whole thing becomes consumed by the company. Sometimes M&As actually result in allowing the company to stand alone by itself, but more often than not, the company gets consumed by the takeover, becomes part of another organization. That gives the acquirer the ability to organically grow their staff, brings in all the capabilities. Companies that I've actually been involved in merger and acquisitions, we've actually been able to offer the industry partner a complete solution to something that they're facing. So for instance, patent cliff on small molecules, they come along to the company, we've got a large molecule pipeline. That's actually being able to bolt that company on and solve a real big problem that companies have got in terms of patent cliff. So that's M&As. And then again, options to acquire, typically on a condition of a trigger. So it can be a milestone from, say, clinical data, but often that option to acquire is something where the commercial terms can be offset, it can be pushed back, rather than in a license where you're dealing with the commercial terms straight up. With the term sheet, sometimes the option to acquire can be pushed back to a point in time when the industry partner knows there's something that they really want, And so therefore that option to acquire is something that today is on the table. And what do I mean by licensing? Well, this is licensing 101. Most of you probably know this, but it's really about licensing involves the intellectual property. What we mean by IP is not just patents. Typically, it's patents that the companies will want to see. And we'll talk about that in terms of milestones and royalties. But it can be in a broader sense. So it's important that we go into this with IP thinking that know-how is important. So your technical know-how, your trade secrets, those are all things that are intangibles, but they are important. They're not perhaps create the same value as a granted patent, but they're important to keep in mind. And these are things which we can keep secret. Sometime in companies, for instance, software companies, you don't want to put a patent in place. You'd rather have those trade secrets, and those are negotiable, right? So those are rights that the company will come along and will value and pay money for. So it's important to keep, as I say, a broader sense of IP rather than just patents. However, having said that, negotiating a license deal, often if there's not a valid claim, a valid patent, it's unlikely you'll get the royalty reach through. So I'll talk about royalty in a second, but royalties really are that reach through to the marketplace, something not just a cash payment up front, but a reach through to the market. And typically, to get royalties, you'd have to have a granted patent. And yet, technology licensing involves reaching an agreement on a complex set of terms. So deal consideration. So, revenue is obviously a key thing, a prime motivator for most negotiations. You want to recoup what you put into all the work that you've done. So you spend, in some cases, millions of dollars getting you to a certain point in a technology platform or a product development, and you want to try and recoup some of that money in a license deal that you do. To recoup that, license revenue is broken into three things largely. So upfront payment. So if you go in there, you'll see that often the deals have got an upfront payment. That means a payment to you on the signature of that contract when that deal is done. And that's what we call an upfront license fee. Typically, the deals I've done typically would have also a milestone-based payment structure. And the milestone payments are based on success of certain triggers. So, for instance, if it's a technology that may go through clinical development, so you could have a preclinical product, but the intention would be to take that through a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. The milestone payments can be on successful completion of phase 1, successful completion of phase 2, and successful completion of phase 3, and then market approval of the product. Sometimes you can get market approval of the product in different territories. So it can be market approval in the EMEA, it can be market approval in the US with the FDA. So those are all the sort of things of milestone triggers that you can get success-based payments. Royalty fees are typically on the sale of the product. So, for instance, if you do a deal with a preclinical product, it goes all the way through success, a successful phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and it gets to market eventually, and the pharma company starts selling your product, then the royalty fee is a percentage of the sales. So it could be a 2% percentage of all the royalty sales of that product on the market. And of course, you can imagine if it's a monoclonal antibody, it's $1 billion market, those could be big fees. And often the license revenue could be some of these, or it can be all of the above. I've done deals where typically the deals that I've done have been deals where it revolves all those three parts to it. So in a deal consideration, it's really important to figure out what the short-term consequences are. So what are your considerations in the short term? Is it to get cash in the door straight away? Or is it taking risk and allowing yourself to push things back for the milestones and the royalties? And often in a scenario of a research institute or a researcher, you would probably want to try and get most things up front. There's less risk to that. There's more risk to pushing things in a back-end deal. So these are all considerations you want to try and have in your mind. So other considerations, what does each party want to obtain? So it's really important to understand, not just from your perspective, what you're giving away, but also what is it that you understand that the licensee wants to get from the deal? What is it they want to get? Will a license need to cover multiple products? Some of the deals that I've done is not just one product, but several products. Structuring the deal in a way where it's got multiple products in there is a little bit more complicated than a single product deal. But, ultimately it can pay off. If there's a successful the first product is successful, it'll lead to get a deal on a successful second and third product. That's where value can be made. And also considerations like it's going to be manufacturing rights or distribution rights for the product. These may be less important for you, as researchers, but it's something to keep in mind down the line. So looking at the long-term big picture, where these things are going to go. So what do we mean by the mutually beneficial deal? And, often we talk about what is the win-win deal? How do we go about, what is it? What do we mean by a win-win deal? Well, a mutually beneficial deal is not one where each side goes in and grabs as much as they can get. In a successful negotiation, it's about understanding and putting yourself into the shoes of the other person that's negotiating with. And there's going to have to be a bit of give and take. It's not about grabbing everything that you want. There's a finite pot of money there or a finite pot of assets, and you go in, you grab as much as you possibly can. Typically, those kind of deals are going to fail. Even if you get it across the line, it's probably not going to be a deal where it's going to be a long-term success. So the best deals are the deals where, on the shake of a hand and the sign of the paper, both sides go away happy and satisfied. So a win-win negotiation involves working to get the best deal possible for yourself, whilst also working to ensure that your counterpart is satisfied. That's really the key in a win-win deal. And, there's going to be give and take. There's going to be things that you're going to have to give up in that negotiation. Going into the negotiation, it's really important to understand what are the key things that you want to keep and the key things that you're willing to put on the table for a deal. So the must-haves, the nice-to-haves. Talk about that in a second. But it also means getting to that mutually beneficial deal means thinking creatively about what it is, how you can get more of what you want by helping the other side get what they want. It kind of sounds counterintuitive, right? It sounds like, how do you get what you want by getting to a point where the other party gets what they want? But that is actually the essence of a mutually beneficial deal. That is the win-win deal, when both sides, as I say, at the end of the negotiation, both sides think they've won. So that is actually the key thing. So, what are the things that we should be doing to try and get there? Asking questions. Do not make a mistake of viewing the negotiation as primarily an exercise in trying to persuade the other party to do what you want them to do. So a lot of times people go into a negotiation and they think, okay, I'm going to be the hardest guy to negotiate this deal. And, if they do everything that I want them to do, then I've won that deal. Typically, as I say, even if you get that kind of deal signed, it's not going to be a deal that's going to be a long-term success. So really understanding, asking the questions, making sure you understand, and then going into a deal, as I said before, preconceived ideas about what it is that the party wants, ask the question, right? Make sure that you, at the early stages of negotiations, you actually ask the question, what it is that they want out of the deal. And that can change over the period of negotiations. So it's a question you might want to ask again halfway through the negotiation is, are you still satisfied? Are these the things that you want? I've often done research into companies before I go into the negotiation. I'll know, okay, I know the company's strapped for cash. So therefore I know that cash is probably the thing that's going to be the key thing that's going to be a driver from their side. So doing that research and understanding exactly what it is that they want, but asking the questions as well. So along the way, making sure that you are aligned rather than making assumptions from the outset. And listen closely to what your counterpart has to say. That will help you collect the information you need to develop a mutually beneficial agreement. So asking questions and listening, those key things, key attributes about a negotiation, about a successful negotiation. Because as I say, rather than just talking and saying things that you think they want to hear, it's really important to stop and to listen. And I'm going to slide there about the power of silence. It's absolutely key that you can use that as a negotiating actual tip and trick. It's really important to actually stop and listen to what they're saying. Plan with the end result in mind. So what I mean by this is that it's very important as a researcher that we keep in mind that what we're creating is the research. It's stuff that may go into a patent, all the research and lab books, all the critical thinking, all the documentation. It's really important to keep your records absolutely up to date. That will help you draft your patents. It will help you get an intellectual property position. It'll help with the priority of dates on your filings. Record keeping and research is key. In terms of patents are absolutely key. Broad claims must be enabled across the claim. What I mean by that is get a good patent attorney to draft the patents. Don't draft patents yourself. It's important that when you're drafting the claims of your patent, you draft it in a way that teaches a person skilled in the art that if they follow your directions in the patent claim, they would actually be able to embody that claim. So that means that you're teaching somebody from the language that are in your claim. Claim dimensions must be sufficiently described. Again, it's a key thing where, you're giving the sufficient information and it's sufficiently backed up through the patent and through the filing and ultimately through the prosecution that your inventions then get to a point where they are grantable. And a composition of matter are king rather than method of use. What I mean by that is, rather than a patent's claim as saying this is the method of use, using this, that's good to have, but it's not as good as composition of matter, which actually blocks the companies in a much more substantial manner. So composition of matter, again, these are things that you can talk to your IP attorneys, tech transfer officers about as you're putting your patents together. Awareness of the regulatory requirements. I mean, even at the early stages, I know it sounds crazy that as a researcher, you start to think about what would a phase 1, 2, 3 trial look like? What would reimbursement look like? It seems like it's an awful long way away. But, the way I kind of look at it when I'm licensing these things or building out product development pipelines is actually always thinking about the end in sight. So always thinking about what that product's going to look like, what the label on that product's going to look like. And so thinking a bit about, as a researcher, about what that regulatory pathway is going to look like, it's important because if you start to get into the negotiation with a big pharma company, for instance, about your research, and then, they start to go, well, okay, whether this is going to be a phase 1, 2 trial scenario, is it going to be a pathway, 505B pathway? All these are probably things that you should think about before you actually get into negotiation. Because ultimately, you think about it, once you've negotiated and done the deal with a pharma company, those are key considerations they're going to have. So if you help them along the way, these are the things that you should be thinking about. The other thing, freedom to operate. So what do we mean by that? I've used that phrase before, but freedom to operate is not just about the intellectual property you have and the filings that you've created around your R&D research. It's also about when you think about the research and you want to get it to market, are there other people's patents that are going to be infringed as you commercialize your technology? Are you going to infringe other people's patents? And that's what we mean by freedom to operate. It's key to think about that when you're getting involved in negotiations, say with a big pharma company. It's key to think that, okay, I've got the IP. This is what I've ring-fenced in terms of my IP, but am I going to go out there and infringe somebody else's patents? And are they going to come back after me and say, when you're at the cutting edge of getting that product to market, are they going to come back and say, you're infringing my IP and you can't commercialize that product? So having some awareness of what freedom to operate is about is actually pretty key in terms of when you get into a negotiation of your technology. So ask questions to ask before embarking on a negotiation. So I've mentioned this idea about what are the motivators for each party. When I go into a negotiation with a company, I'll do my background research. I'll try and figure out what I think the motivators are for them. I mentioned one company, I knew that cash was going to be an issue that they wanted. So it was a way of negotiating the upfront cash and payment that they would get. I knew that that's where they were most focused on. Therefore, you can get more value out of doing the back end deal with the milestones and royalties. What are the motivators for the party? It could be a need for a new product. Again, the product pipeline idea, bolstering their pipelines. That is absolutely one area that they're looking at. If that's the case, and you think that's the motivator, then, again, you can play to that strength by saying, my technology is going to be the product that's going to come along. It's going to be able to add to your pipeline. Going into the negotiation with a realistic time frame, often you'll see parties going into a negotiation with absolutely unrealistic timeframes. But if I was to take an example of a deal where it's involved an upfront, a milestone, and a royalty rate with a big pharma company, that deal's going to take time. The average is 9 months from pitch to deal closure. So these kind of deals, big deals, get done and can take longer. I've done deals which have taken 12 months to do. So, going into this with a negotiation, don't expect these things to happen overnight. Especially when it gets to the commercial terms, where there's upfront payments, royalties, and milestones. That's when it gets difficult. The more complex the deal, the higher up it goes into the other organization, higher level it goes up to. One of the deals I did had to go to the chief executive of GSK. So it had to go all the way up to the top guy, and he only sat, I think it was twice a year on deals, looking at those deals. I think maybe twice a year. So understanding exactly, what that timeline is really important. What data and documents do you need for you and for the other party? So thinking about when you get into that negotiation, what is it that you need to pull together to actually be convincing enough for the due diligence? And we'll talk about due diligence in a second, but that's where, the party comes along and looks at what you've got, looks under the hood of what you've got in terms of your technology or product, looks at the intellectual property, looks at your plans in terms of regulatory plans or clinical plans, product sheets, all that kind of stuff. Those are all things that you should consider putting together in an organized fashion before you start to get into a negotiation with a party. The data room is a great way of actually organizing that information in a sort of central repository where you can have it ready to allow another party to come in and access it. Data room is an electronic, like a library where you can put all your information into one place and you allow the access to the other party into that data room. You can control what they see, you control how long they see it for. So it's a great tool to be able to use when you get into that real cutting edge time of having that negotiation with the other party. And actually, the other quick question to ask yourself before embarking on the negotiation, who's going to be on your team? Make sure you get the parties on board, make sure everybody's aligned in their thinking. That deal team from a university or institute perspective can involve tech transfer, it can involve business development, it can involve intellectual property, lawyers, it can involve legal as well. So legal can be there, get them into a room, get them talking, get them early stages. It's really important that everybody's on the same page about what it is that you want to try and achieve. Know your goals before you start. What's the best deal imaginable? What is the dream deal that would be the perfect deal to do? And then as a default, think about what's the best deal realistically. What is it you would actually walk away and still be happy with? So what's your dream deal and what's the deal that you'd still walk away and still go, okay, that's not, I can live with that. I can live with that. So, what position can you live with? What's the must-haves? What is it, the key things you can't go away and give to the other party? So understanding that, it could be things like, for instance, ownership of the platform. You don't want to hand it completely over and not have any further access to that platform in the future. So that's a must-have. That means, you still want to control. It could be for research purposes only, but if that's something that you want to make sure that you continue, that's your must-have. So that's a line in the sand you're not going to go across. But knowing that line in the sand from the outset is really important. So what's your must-haves? And then what's your nice-to-haves? What are the areas that you go, okay, ideally I wouldn't want to give this up, but if I have to, and if push comes to shove, and you get into a corner, that's something that you're willing to give away, something you're willing to trade with, and that's your nice-to-haves. And so I come to this phrase, you're going to hear this phrase sometimes in negotiations, you'll hear out there, best alternative to negotiated agreement. So, what can you do if the current negotiations fail? What are the alternatives? So an understanding of what that is from the outset is really important. So determining the worth of each alternative. So what are the alternatives? How much does each of those alternatives mean to you? And then go in with the option that provides the most value to you. So that is what we mean by the best alternative to negotiated agreement. You can look at this up on the internet if you want some more information about this, but it is a key thing that you'll hear again and again from negotiation courses, the BATNA. If you don't know what your BATNA is, you risk accepting a poor deal. So it is all about this idea about, what is the value to me? What am I giving up? What am I willing to trade? But, this idea of the best alternative to the negotiated agreement, important to know from the outset, so you've got some sense of that. So what are the sources of risk in negotiating deals? So, well, doing the wrong deal, it's possible, right? You could go in there and the wrong deals get done, but at least if you know the risk mitigation strategies, what are the risks? You can try and then plan to try and prevent those risks. Doing the wrong deal or doing the wrong partner, those are two of the most common, right? Sometimes you can't actually identify that from the outset. You go in there with the best intentions, the partner goes in there with the best intentions. Things change. In the case of a big pharma company, there's leadership changes, there's strategic changes that happen in the company on a regular basis. Sometimes the technology you do the deal with and the people you do the deal with, there's changeovers and things change. But you can try and at least mitigate that by getting a sense of who the right partner might be. And that is like this idea of preparation, proper planning prevents poor performance. It's going in there and actually looking to see listing out, who your potential partners could be. I actually do it on a tier basis. So I've got tier 1 partners, tier 2 partners, tier 3 partners. The tier 1 partners or where there's a close synergy of what you've got with what they want. It could be on the basis of product pipeline. It could be on the basis of research direction, mission statements they make out there in the public. But doing that research. The other area of negotiating deals is poor negotiating skills, practices, inadequate legal documentation, getting it wrong from the outset, not putting CDAs in place, talking about things that are confidential, know-how that's not covered by a CDA, a lack of doing things like term sheets and putting a structure in place. And also often not getting the lawyers in at an early enough stage. Often as researchers, we get involved in the tech push. We get excited about the fact that another party is really interested in it. Before you know it, you're talking about stuff that really would have been better holding back, putting into a confidential disclosure agreement and actually controlling that information flow. And also, negotiating a deal, IP control. Sometimes, when you've done the deal, the other party now has control of that platform, and it can be a way that you can lose control of your intellectual property. So it's a thing that you should keep in mind for it. And then post-deal, sometimes I know deals that have been done and, as I say, things can change and the company doesn't commercialize the product. And so they're sitting with the IP and it doesn't get to market. So, awareness of that, awareness of those things can happen. It's important. So what do I mean by term sheet? I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. Term sheet is really a list of key terms. It creates a structure for your negotiations. It helps sort through some of the complex problems in your exercise. It forms the backbone of the final agreement. So once you've nailed the term sheet, you just extract that term sheet and put it into your contract. It forms the backbone of the contract. And once you've got that term sheet negotiated, it makes your negotiation much easier beyond that. And it also helps you keep on track of the negotiation. So here's a sample of the term sheet. I've downloaded this from Ohio University. It's on the internet. It's the only reason I chose that one. You can look at the rights, the field of use. The field of use could be a specific area where you're allowing them rights to that. It could be an RNA technology for therapeutic use in cancer, for instance. It outlines what your upfront license fees are, what your milestone fees are, and then royalty rates. So again, I talked about royalty rates. What are you going to get on eventually if that pharma company gets the product, sells it on the market? What kind of percentage sales would you get? And it gets a lot more complicated than that. It can get into points where they start to tier the royalties, they'll tier it up, tier it down. But that's the sort of information that you're putting into your term sheet. Patent expense reimbursement, so it can be about intellectual property, who's going to pay what for what, etc. And diligence milestones are, once you've done your deal, how do you keep the other party on track? How do you know that they're going to commercialize the technology? Put triggers in there. There can be things like return clauses. If they don't do the commercialization, you can get a return clause put in there from a diligence point of view. Understand who you're dealing with. So I think really key is identify the companies that might be interested in your technology, do a background check as much as you possibly can through public information, study the pipelines, mission statements, it's online. You want to understand how your technology or product fits in with their current product line or your technology line. I use product a lot in this talk, but it could be equally the case for their technologies. How does your technology sit? Say they're developing a platform, an RNA platform. You've got a piece of technology that's great for delivering RNA. So understand exactly, there's how it fits. You're going to create a solution for the problems that they have with their RNA platform. How does it enhance it? How does it complement it? And gain support of an internal champion. Usually, as I say, an earlier stage technology requires technical people to be on board, not business people. I learned that pretty early on. And so, once I learned that, I learned who's going to be on my deal team pretty quick. So I'd know that if I went out to talk to GSK, it wouldn't just be me talking about the technology, but I'd be bringing the key technology people, the key researchers, the key tech people, so that they could talk to their tech people. That's where you start to make the bridges in terms of research, especially around technologies, is you start to talk tech before you start talking business. Gathering intelligence, really important. Get out there, network, figure out, go out to professional associations, Biomedical Network, Biotech, in terms of healthcare, trade fairs, scientific conferences. The more you get out there, the more you talk about your technology, make sure you push, you've got confidentiality. If you're going to do an abstract, don't disclose confidential information in the abstract in advance of getting some IP overview of your research, because that could actually be disclosure of your key research. You don't want to do that. Just take advice from tech transfer also. Do competitor analysis, always important to know who the competitors are. So yeah, lots of free information out there and lots of information on specific deals as well. So there are paid sources where you can go, broadly source pitch book. There are paid sources where you can actually do deal. Prepare for your due diligence, put a CDA in place, consider non-confidential and confidential summaries. So that's where you go, okay, I've got this tech, I pull together my pitch and I go, okay, what can I talk without a CDA in place? It's because sometimes the company will go, I don't want to sign a CDA straight away. So what's the non-confidential summary? It could be a one-pager, it could be a two-pager that you're not going to give away any key bits of information. And then beyond that, once you sign the CDA, what does a confidential summary pack look like? You put those together actually before you start negotiating with parties. Yeah, look, I think I'll skip through this. Preparation, really key. I mean, just do your preparation before you go out there. Use the term sheets. It's a great tool to talk to within your teams. Involve your lawyers early on in the negotiations. And as I said, using a term sheet means drafting the final agreement should be really straightforward. Preparation, absolutely key. Use your bargaining power on the issues that matter. Don't get caught in the weeds. Don't die in a ditch on certain things. There are things you have to just give up. It's important also not to think it's a deal or no deal. Often these deals actually develop through the negotiation. There are ways you can still get a deal done, being inventive and by giving up certain things. And of course, it's just nowhere to walk away. There's sometimes a deal can't be done, and there's times when I've stood up and walked out the door and that's fine. If there's somebody who's going to be interested in technology, there'll be others that will be. If you can't do a deal with one, there'll be others that are there. Know your goals before you start. Consider your fallback positions. Be aware of what you're giving away. So do your research on your partner before you start negotiating. Think like the licensee. How much value is your IP bringing to the potential licensee? So the more you understand about what the value is and the solutions you're solving for them, you can then understand the value, what you're doing in the deal, what you can do. Always protect yourself with a CDA before negotiations begin. You don't want to give away things that are key. That includes, as I say, not just patents, but know-how, technical information. These are all key things that you want to keep close to your chest. And term sheet. And then remember, successful licensing should be mutually beneficial to both parties. So it comes back down to the whole ethos of this whole talk. What is the win-win? When you sign that deal and you shake the person's hand, both parties can be absolutely sure that both parties are going to walk away from that happy. And that's actually what we want away. And ultimately, if you can't do that, don't be afraid to walk. That's ultimately the case. There are times when deals just can't be done. Walk away and another deal can be done sometime down the line. All right, that's the question.
Thanks, Rob. That was jam-packed, but very, very useful. So I'm just going to launch a poll while we get to the questions and answers. Please fill us in. It's appreciated just taking the extra time. All right, so Benjamin had a question. You might have answered it already, but Benjamin, if you want to just ask Rob what you put in the chat.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Rob, for your very informative presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I have two questions. One I put in the chat. So the first one is, how do you know when to walk away from a deal, but also preserve or maintain the relationship for a future potential deal?
That's a great question. I think that comes down to the idea of that relationship that you're building. So, you build the relationship on mutual respect. When it gets to a point in the deal and you both realize that it's just not going to be done, there's certain things that you can't do. You've got that mutual respect relationship, turning around and just going, look, at this point in time, we can't do it, but let's always keep in mind that things may change. Let's come back and talk about it another day. And that's the way you maintain that relationship, is with that mutual respect. Because there are times when it just can't be done. So does that answer the question there?
Yeah, thank you. And the second one I had was, you mentioned that deals can take 9 to 12 months or longer, but I was curious, how do you leverage the use of tone, pause, and silence to maximize your deal making?
Yeah, Luke, silence, the way I use silence actually is, and I talk power of silence. Power of silence actually is actually right in the middle of the negotiation. Going quiet in a deal, when it gets to build up traction in a deal, you don't want to go quiet, because often that will mean that parties will find other things to do. Everybody's busy. So you want to try and keep the momentum. When you start going along a deal, you want to keep the momentum to the end. Important. However, the power of silence, when I talk about the power of silence, I'm talking about you're in the room, you're surrounded by people negotiating, and it's often really quite a powerful negotiating tactic. Just sit back and actually be quiet. Because often there will be a need from the other party to fill that space. And actually that's sometimes when you get, it's a tactic that a lot of people use, but that's actually a key time when you actually find out that they can actually give away things. So that's what I mean by power silence.
Thanks, Rob.
All right. So anybody else want to ask Rob a super quick question?
I think Ella's got one there.
Oh, okay. Daniela?
Yes, so hi Rob. Just on the freedom to operate, right? So you talked a bit about, the risk of infringing other people's IP. So, as researchers, we get involved in a lot of projects. And for example, in my case, I worked for a company before. So now, like when you get employed again, of course, people will employ you for the skills that you already have. So how, for example, when you get involved in another project that has some sort of similarities, how do you manage that freedom to operate? You know what I mean? Like if you get involved in something slightly similar and you file an IP then afterwards, how can you manage that? So that will be my question.
Yeah, look, it's a really good one. My experience with freedom to operate was in the monoclonal antibody sector where it's just a minefield. And the way you navigate that really, well, there are a couple of things there. Your research, filing similar patents to similar areas, it really depends on who owns the patents. It's really going to get down to, if it's a different university, you've now filed it, it's really their issue to try and navigate who's going to have to cross license. So that comes down to, again, there could be issues there with you file something very similar to the other one. It may be that the second patent will never get to be granted because there's already a prior on the previous technology. But ultimately, it comes down to the licensee's problem, really. I mean, they're going to have to be the ones that go, okay, Deacon's got that, but Monash has got that. Right, how am I going to do that? So it's their issue. Talk to your IP attorneys, though. They're the ones that are experts at that.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks, Danielle.
Thank you, Rob.
I'll see you all next week. Thanks for doing the poll. Our last one next week is PD plus health and health apps and big data, commercial opportunities. So thanks very much, Rob. It's been a real pleasure having you part of the series. Hopefully you'll be able to return in a couple of years.
I hope so too. All right.
Thank you. Goodbye,
All right.
everyone.